Hi, Jamie. It's great to
Hi.
see you again.
Good morning. Good morning. Great to see you.
We've been having chats about what to talk about today, and I guess on the back of your response to Marge's response to Asha, I wondered if we could maybe talk a little bit about when we think about Gestalt processing. And notice I haven't used the word Gestalt language processing, I've used Gestalt processing. I guess all of us are feeling it's not just speech, it's not just language, it feels a lot more. And I guess I'd really like to pick your brains on this one.
Wow. I've noticed that myself that in a lot of the things that I've been writing over the last year, I've kind of dropped the language part as well. Because if I'm a Gestalt processor in everything that I do. From speaking to reading to interpreting the world,
Mm.
to the way I exist in a relationship, in terms of my own family, as a classroom teacher with parents and all of that kind of stuff. The way I perceive things is whole apart, right? And so I've been very kind of conscious of that in my writings to not just kind of self-identify as a Gestalt language processor, but more using the language processor part where it's appropriate when we're talking about language, but using Gestalt processor as an identification or an identity when we are not talking about language, when we're talking about relationship or those types of things, it makes more
Mm.
sense to drop that language part. It really does.
And I think as a speech and language therapist or pathologist, as we you say in the US, actually, although when I'm supporting families or educational professionals with children and young people who I think may be Gestalt language processors, whilst I am thinking about communication and that side of um, their life, it feels so much more than that. When I actually think about a session, it might be for some children, it might be that we're thinking about literacy. For others, it might be around play, around um, routines, around transitions, around sensory preferences. So it feels much bigger. And yet it's kind of like put in this box of Gestalt language processing. But, from reading your essays, it feels so much bigger. And you talked just before we came on to record about how even in your own life, you have uh sort of units like for your family unit, and in that family unit you use your scripts that are mitigated from things that your family have said, and then you're using them in context and using them back to them. But it's not just about the language, it's about the whole emotion, um, the situation, the setting, everything. It encompasses all that you're about.
Oh, aye, and you've said it, so we could be done now, right? Oh, I've been thinking a lot about this over the last year. I really have. Um, and again, my wife and I having conversations about all of this stuff because all of this is new to her as well. I was just Jamie. I just did things. I didn't really have a depth to me that I do now because I had no access to it. It wasn't like trapped or whatever. It was just locked away. It was a whole gestalt. It was stored. And when the conditions were ready and I was safe and secure, then here we are.
Mm,
Um, I've said to her and I've said to others that when we first met, almost 30 years ago now, I wasn't very verbal at all. I was never expected to be. And then, from the standpoint of I sound the way I sound, um, being different in the 70s in America would start fights. And indeed they did. And I never wanted to be that person that was always in fights. But bullies are bullies and things happened or whatever. But I learned to kind of hide myself and keep myself to myself. And so, because I'm so very tall and because I'm so very stout and so, I sound different and I behave differently in a time before autism, um, I just shut up, really. And
Hmm.
so, when I met my wife, and of course I'm sounding different, and she's typical American female or whatever. It was like kind of intrigued, like, why do you sound this way? And etc. Um, and then she would talk and I would listen and I absolutely loved it. And she gave me so many, California words, American words. And she's so eloquent and so fluent in conversation. And I just shut up and listen. And this many years later, I've taken all of that stuff from her, from my children, and I've mitigated them. And so my professional vocabulary, my outside the house, sound is different than my inside the house because the words are different, and because I find those scripts, those words, those emotions that are attached to him, so special, so wonderful. I don't really want to spoil them outside. I don't want to give them to others, and have them toy with them. And I think that's a kind of an emotional response of somebody who has been bullied to say, no,
Hmm.
I'm going to keep this to myself. You're not going to see it. You're not going to know about it. Um, and so that's that. And um, I think that's perfectly normal, right?
Mm.
And I really reject that Gestalt processors are deficient or defective or disabled or whatever. We're just different. We just have a different way
Mm.
of going. And as I have an article that I've written for about 10 days from now for release, um, Gestalt processors, they were normal. They were the default in our ancestral past. And it's only since, industrial capitalism where this type of part to whole had to happen, for efficiencies and factories and all of this kind of trainings that needed to become, and standardization and all of this stuff. So analytic processing is relatively new in humanity, and yet it's defended as though it is handed down from on high and it's always been this way and so on. And so I think that kind of attitude has flavored, the last couple of years of essays and speeches and of course my books and
Mm.
stuff. But um, if I'm a Gestalt processor, I'm a Gestalt processor everywhere, right?
Yeah.
In my relationships, in my work life, and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. And I think again it remind I think I again I shared this with you about thinking about students that I've worked with in the past and understanding that now feels a bit late in the day, but it really helps me now reflect and I guess feel um, disappointed in myself that I didn't understand because I might have um, acknowledged some of those things and thought those things through in my sessions with children and young people um, because of the wholeness rather than just going into my little area of speech and language therapy and whatever goals or supports that I was thinking about. It didn't incorporate this wholeness and I guess the emotional side as well as much as I would have liked. Um, and sort of like listening to you talking, so I've read this week as well about, the sort of uh, Gestalt processor love language. That was really, really interesting as well. And it's that essence of not just language, not just communication, emotion, and how those are so much tied into how we interpret, process, and kind of then reflect on scenarios in our lives.
Aye, well, the article that, or the essay that I wrote for today,
Mm.
um, kind of speaks to that, right? My wife, she has trouble comprehending. Like when I say to her, I loved you as soon as I met you, right? And in my mind, whole to part, I already saw like, oh yeah, we can be married and we can do all of these things on day one, right? And to an analytic processor, there are these gateways that you must go through, the initial courtships and the timelines and the things that happen according to plan. And, you know, my brain don't work that way. It's whole apart, right? So I can imagine the entirety of it. And then if you can imagine as a youngling, like if you're loving everybody, right, then you're thought of as promiscuous, right? And so I tried to explain this, and it's a very odd thing as a parent, as a Gestalt processing parent of Gestalt processors who are, the young generation. They don't value conversation with elders. They really don't. But they do love to spy on us, on our social media and so on. And so a lot of my Instagram, a lot of my essays are to them, the understanding that they're spying on me. And so these are instructions, these are, those types of guides and whatnot, because I think children are afraid of asking very tricky, difficult, intimate questions of adults,
Mm.
especially, parents and stuff. And so I've always rejected kind of having that talk, right? This is how love is, this is how you must behave as a youngling in America, etc. Um, and so I just write it and I leave it there. And I know that they spy on me because things eventually filter into our conversations. And so I wrote a series about love and different formats as I've experienced it and been adjacent to it and so on, because I only have one child left in my house. They're all adults, right? And
Mm.
they're navigating things. And what does this look like? My house is an autistic house. My house is a Gestalt language processing house. It's a Gestalt house. And so I leave all of these scripts, and then as usual, other people find them, useful or not. But there are there are things in America that are happening right now that have been happening for a while where my way of viewing the world is seen as evil, is seen as promiscuous, is seen as, you know, defective or whatever. You're not allowed to love everybody, right? And why not? Why not start from there and then let people sort themselves out? And then as they do, you're either still in love or not,
Yeah.
right? And so from that standpoint, there's a poem that I included in today's from Poppy Cockburn that is just classic Gestalt processor, right? I still love everyone I've loved, and I think about them whilst the water boils, right? And it's so very kind of how we Gestalt processors handle memory. We don't discount loves. We don't discount friendships that happened 20 years ago simply because we haven't seen that person. In the Gestalt, in that now that exists in storage, it's whole,
Hmm.
it's real. It always existed that way. And I don't think people quite understand that.
And you
And,
can
and so
really
that's
feel that emotion about
right.
those, what that love
Aye,
was, what that friendship was, even if it was 20 years ago.
right. Absolutely. And on the love side, on the more adult things, right? And I've said this in quite a different many ways. All of the discourse around Gestalt processing, around autism, never imagines that we reach adulthood. And if we do, we're seen as a burden. None of it is written from the standpoint of we will grow up, we will love, we will be parents, we will be grandparents, we will have employment, we will have everything that everybody else has. We'll just have it as we are, not as they are. And so when I do things like conferences and when I talk to parents, they assume, I think, because the propaganda is just massive, that if you're a Gestalt processor, if you're having language problems, you'll grow out of them. You'll be taught out of them. You'll be therapied out of them. And then by the time you're 18, you'll be good to go and everything's fine. Right? Same thing with
Mm.
autism. If we just do the right therapies, extinguish these behaviors, then you'll be a normal person.
And I
But we know
guess
that's not
that's
true.
no. And I guess that is um your legacy, Marge's legacy, Alexandria Zakos's legacy, um, Dr. Barry Presant's legacy is that we know that once a Gestalt processor, always a Gestalt processor. And I think that many of us feel so passionately that we're not trying to change, we're trying to connect. And it's through that connection that we can really make the most impact on children, young people's, adults' lives as well. At the conference, we had a speech and language therapist from Ireland, and she's been supporting adult GLPs and making some, really interesting progress and making an impact on their lives, which is fantastic. But I agree with you, Jamie. We're not trying to change. We're not trying to make someone not a Gestalt processor. It's accepting, acknowledging, and supporting in every way we can. I'm really aware that you are just about to go and record another podcast. So I feel we should probably stop there for today. So many things to think about, and it feels like we could do another 3 podcasts on the back of what we've been talking today, at
I,
the very least.
well, we could chat for hours and hours and hours. And nobody would listen. They'd tune out after a while. But I think, the kind of summary of all of this, how I prepare for these sessions
Hmm.
is not necessarily unique to me. I'm a Gestalt processor and I prepare in the same way. You see the evidence of it, you see the residue of it in essays, right? I have to spend the time, and it's a lot of time. How I come to what I know, um, that question comes up a lot. How do you go from, this to that or whatever? Or I knew you 30 years ago. This doesn't sound at all like you or whatever. And so is not, Jamie has a PhD or Jamie has written books or whatever. I know it's a no because I'm 55 years old and I've lived it. And now I have the ability on the platform to write it as I park these gestalts, right? And the third, I think, is kind of why this matters at all, right? And it matters. And I have these debates at school in the maths classroom with my colleagues because in actuality, we're the majority of the population of the world. And that fact has been written out of existence by the naysayers of the world. But we are the majority. So it shows up in classrooms, it shows up in behavior plans, it shows up in crisis responses. How to get Jamie to not be this way. And you cannot train a snake to be a bear, right? It doesn't work that way. And so I think a lot of this is just me, explaining situated knowing and getting better at it year by year. Now that the Substack is going into its 4th year.
Wow. Well, that's a good place to finish, I feel, Jamie.
All right.
And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure as always. And I will see you next week.
All right. Looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Okay.